Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 47, chapter 47, entitled Keep Your Enemies Closer. Damn it! We have no game plan! Midoriya scrambled up to Bakugo, fighting the instinctual, cowardly desire to run. Bakugo! But Bakugo charged forward instead. Don't fucking order me around! He stopped right in the hero's path, pressing both of his wrists together while digging his heels into the dirt. Midoriya recognized the stance from his own training, whipping his head over to Gami. Get down! A massive flash exploded from Bakugo's palms, right into All Might's eyes. The light leaked far past the intended target, forcing Midoriya to shield his eyes so he wouldn't be stunned, too. He couldn't see his mentor in all the chaos, but based on the shrill screech that echoed from his side, his warning wasn't fast enough. Bakugo snapped his arms behind him and blasted forward, forcing Midoriya to retreat back to avoid getting hit. He glanced around frantically. Gah! He caught himself as he noticed a small wisp of the ghost's robe oozing from the earth below him. Midoriya was forced to move his focus, however, as he watched All Might snatch Bakugo midair by the face. Sorry. He was getting whiplash at this point, turning back to the ground where Gami slowly rose from, dazed and drowsy. But we should leave while we can. Midoriya looked mortified. We can't just leave him, not again. Bakugo released another barrage of bright explosions even from All Might's hold, and the ghost cried out in pain again, sinking back into the darkness of the earth. But the blast seemed to have no effect on the number one hero as he instead grabbed the other by his gauntlet and slammed him into the ground. Is that all you got? Bakugo's chest heaved in a stutter, but he didn't answer, nor did he move. As for these two, they've let their imperfections drive them, and for that they don't deserve the title of hero. Midoriya's heart stopped, and then kick-started again from desperation. Why couldn't he stop seeing Ida? And now, All Might turned his gaze to him. You'll join him, young Midoriya. All Might rushed at him, but thanks to the weights, Midoriya was able to move away before he could get too close. Skidding on his heels, he and All Might basically swapped places, and out of the corner of his eye, he could see Bakugo's limp form. You're not going to fight him, are you? Good to know Gami was back. He'd need all the help he could get. Gonna get out of here, Midoriya mumbled. All Might must have heard him mutter, because he stared pointedly into his soul. You're going to abandon the team and run? Yet all Midoriya could see was the hero killer's unhinged maw, bloody teeth, and murderous stare, accompanied by the fallen bodies of Ida, Native, and Todoroki. I'm fighting for a happy ending, forever and beyond if that's what it takes. Midoriya steeled over, curling his hands into fists. He wasn't going to leave Bakugo behind, not again. He'd been doing that his whole life without so much as a second thought, and he refused to make that same mistake again. He was going to fix this. He didn't care what it took or what it would cost. He stood protectively between All Might and Bakugo. If there was even a chance he could make this better again, he'd take it 1,000 times over. Midoriya jumped back, planning on grabbing Bakugo's body and retreating until they could come up with a real plan, but just as his feet left the ground, a loud explosion rang out behind him. He barely had time to turn his head. All he could catch was the sight of Bakugo, perfectly fine, now flying towards him. Move! But he couldn't. There was no time. Gami yanked hard on his coattails, pulling him down and just barely out of the way in time to avoid colliding with Bakugo. It wasn't a perfect maneuver, but he managed to roll to a stop rather than crash midair. Damn it, that was too risky. He glanced at his mentor fiercely, upset that he would pull a trick so suspicious-looking, but the words got caught in his throat as he spoke. Gami stood hunched over, shriveled into a small ball. As his body leaked copious amounts of mist and fog, Midoriya only presumed he was made of underneath all of his robes. But what? The explosion, the light. Gami had gotten too close to it in order to pull him out of the way, and neither of them knew the extent of why bright light caused such a severe reaction in the ghost, or its potential long-term consequences. Midoriya cursed under his breath. Go under. Take as long as you need. But Gami groaned, clutching his head. You're my partner, he whispered, watching Bakugo get up and charge towards All Might again. I need you to be all right so we can figure out how to pass this. Bakugo fired off another explosion, but the hero simply tanked it, forcing the other to retreat back before lunging from a different angle. I can handle this for now. Nezu huffed at the monitors, drawing Aizawa and Yamada's attention back to him after being so engrossed in all of Midoriya's close calls so far. Aizawa raised an eyebrow, opening his mouth to speak, but the rodent's growing smile shut him up. Well, there's no point in stopping the exam now. Nezu threw his hands up in mock disappointment, so fake they could taste the chemicals. The field is far too destroyed to restart. Yamada's eyes nearly popped out of his skull. Why the hell was Nezu bringing this up now, just that they'd managed to calm down to a somewhat stable, neutral ground again? It was almost like he was trying to instigate the fighting again. He didn't miss the way his grin grew even wider, as Aizawa's vexation returned. Aizawa could hear murmurs start up again as he turned his gaze back down to Nezu, but at this point, he couldn't be bothered to care anymore. What the hell are you getting at? What kind of sick game do you think this is? Nezu chuckled, simply shaking his head and turning his attention back to the screens. Yamada's blood ran cold as realization hit him like a semi-truck. You are seeing this as a game, aren't you? All this infighting. You think it's fun? One of the other teachers, 13, finally spoke up, placing a gloved hand on Yamada's shoulder. Guys, I get you're upset, but in front of everyone. They gestured towards the students, whispering amongst each other. This really isn't the time. No. Aizawa broke away from the crowd, away from Yamada, moving towards Nezu as his partner's words churned in his head. This decision, all the decisions you've claimed to have made for the benefit of your students, they all knew who in particular he was talking about. How many have been truly for them? Nezu stayed silent for a moment, before a small laugh bubbled out of his throat, and then another and another, until he was full out cackling. The room fell into silence, everyone so caught off guard by the unexpected reaction that no one knew what to say, if anything at all. What could they say to the principal of the very school supposed to keep them all safe? Finally, his laughter died down as he wiped a tear from his eye. Ah, Aizawa-san, you never fail to entertain me. Though I must say your newfound attachment to Midoriya does have me especially amused. Why does his well-being compel you so? Nezu shrugged, not bothering to even look him in the eyes. Midoriya is no different than any other human, and certainly not any more important. He will either pass this test or he will fail, and regardless, we will simply move on to the next one. Nezu kept his focus glued onto the screen in front of him, now displaying more video feed of Bakugo yelling what was likely more profanities at Midoriya. And as Aizawa stared aghast at the principal's words, he desperately searched his beady black eyes for something resembling sympathy or regret. Instead, he found what almost looked like joy. Something sickening settled in Aizawa's gut. Nezu turned back to him and smiled yet again, much like a doctor greeting one of his many patients. That is simply how this all works. Midoriya raised an arm to shield himself from the gust of air that came off of All Might's latest punch, digging his feet into the dirt to keep himself from falling prone again. He hadn't attacked the hero himself, merely ducking, dodging, and staying defensive while Bakugo provided an unrelenting yet unsuccessful assault. There was no way they were going to win, with an all-out frontal attack, not against the literal #1 hero in the country, but nothing he'd said had managed to get through to his partner. Through the dust, he caught All Might's emerging fist heading straight to Bakugo's head, and he did the only thing that popped into his brain. He grabbed Bakugo's gauntlet and pulled hard. They tumbled off to the side, far enough from the attack to come out unscathed. Midoriya scrambled to his feet just as Bakugo shrugged him off like he was a poison. Don't touch me, I swear to God. We don't have time for this, Midoriya scolded, frustration starting to bubble in his gut. Damn it! Can't you see this isn't working? Let's retreat and try something else. You're so fucking annoying, the blonde scowled, refusing to look him in the eye. I will win. Misty tendrils started to collect around his feet as Gami slowly recovered from his moment of weakness. We should just leave him. He clearly won't cooperate. Midoriya pressed his eyes together. A terrible mistake on the battlefield, yet he saw no flaw in it as something worse threatened to escape from inside him. I don't need you. I don't need anyone. You don't need him. We can do this. Midoriya couldn't hold it in anymore. God, just stop! Just fucking stop! Shut up! His eyes burned with an unfamiliar fury, as his mouth bared fangs of venom he never knew he had. An anger he tried so hard to ignore, his desperation to be the better person, it all melted away in the heat of his exasperation. He was so angry, at himself, at Bakugo, at Nezu, at the world as it seeped out of him like toxic waste, infecting the very ground he stood on. And it all died down as he watched the look on Bakugo's face morph back into that one of confusion he caught earlier. And for the second time since the exercise started, he watched that foggy mask of hatred break for just a moment. For just a second. For just that moment, Bakugo looked like that kid he saved in the alleyway all that time ago. The battle had almost seemed to stop, just for the two of them, just for Midoriya's anger to be swept away by an ocean of guilt. But the light of the sun was blocked out by a familiar shadow. For the time being, The two kids looked up in surprise to see All Might barreling upon them, a broken guardrail in his hands. Izuku! There was no time. Midoriya screamed as he was knocked to the ground, his chest crushed between the dirt and one of the metal bars of the guardrail, pinning him like a hunted animal. A present for the boy who wants to run. Bakugo tried to react. All Might's fist met his stomach before he could. And one for the boy who wants to fight. Spit and bile exploded from Bakugo's mouth before he was sent tumbling away in a heap. Midoriya cried out instinctively, squirming and kicking his legs, desperately trying to escape. His brain melted into panic, tears bubbling at his eyes as everything came rushing back. I want to hear that heroic little facade of yours break. He tore at his first glove. Why did he still have his gloves on? With his teeth. But I see you have something I want. How thoughtful of you. Gami had been trying to lift the guardrail out of its wedged place in the earth, but it wasn't enough. Not fast enough. Not strong enough. Damn it, help me! His voice was wet with fear. All Might strolled towards Bakugo, who shakingly picked himself back up from the ground. Sweat, spit, and stomach acid dripped from his chin as he heaved his chest in a broken symphony, looking up as All Might looked down upon him. Why all this anger, this hate? The hero dropped his shoulders. Do you fear young Midoriya is finally catching up to you? Bakugo did not answer. Finally getting both his gloves off, Midoriya stretched his arms back as far as they could go. But even so, his fingertips just barely missed contact with the metal. The pace at which we grow is not equal for everyone. You must have known that your classmates would catch up to you eventually. He didn't miss how Bakugo clenched his hands tightly at his words. All Might frowned. Why does that anger you so? Bakugo did not answer. Midoriya scraped away at the ground, trying to pull himself free in vain. His chest cracked and groaned like tired door hinges, just one sharp movement away from snapping completely. What you're doing is such a waste. Don't you get it? Surely you must, All Might pleaded to him. Even you can still grow so much. Bakugo did not answer. Midoriya's fingers slowly dug the ground beneath him away into dust. But what needs to grow isn't your strength. Shut your mouth. Bakugo stood shakily, one arm at his side, the other curled around his stomach. Even from a distance, Midoriya could see the empty void in his eyes. If I ever need to borrow that fucking runt's, that complete waste of space is strength. He barely whispered the words out, yet all Midoriya could hear was them echoing around in his skull. Then it'd be better to lose completely. Something in Midoriya surged. He recognized it. Is that so? All Might's face darkened as he raised his fist, unceremoniously. Bakugo lowered his head, giving up. This time, Midoriya didn't hold any of it back. Then don't regret this. A deafening explosion cracked in the distance as Midoriya's body flew across the field, the guardrail previously holding him captive now easily knocked out of the earth. He sailed right past All Might, nailing Bakugo in the face with an angered punch of his own as All Might's fist hit nothing but air. You'd rather lose! You'd rather lose? You, of all people! Everything leaked from Midoriya's cries, anger, shame, disappointment, guilt. What the hell did you turn into? What the fuck have you become? As their momentum started to die down, Midoriya scooped Bakugo up under one of his arms and released another blast, desperately trying to pull off their shaky getaway. The other squirmed. Let me go, you fucking... Enough already! Midoriya unleashed another blast in quick succession. He glanced over his shoulder, hoping he'd build up enough speed as he watched All Might prepare to give chase. He moved his focus back forward, pushing out every drop of adrenaline he had. All Might bent his knees, readying himself to leap forward, but as he tried, he found he could not. Looking down in confusion, he spotted it. The remains of the guardrail he used to pin Midoriya were now tangled tightly around one of his feet, spikes dug thoroughly into the earth. He yanked his foot with significant strength, but it did not come free. What the? He cursed. How had Midoriya had time to... Surely no hunk of metal was this strong. Gami held the guardrail down even as All Might tugged harder, desperately pushing out as much strength as his old bones could give. His body grew hazy from exhaustion, yet he did not lose his grip. He would not let anything happen to his boy. His strength surged. All Might could only watch as the two weaved down an alleyway and disappeared from his sight. Aizawa diligently watched the monitors, a smile finally breaking on his lips when Midoriya managed to drag Bakugo away from the battlefield. And while it wasn't the sneakiest move, especially with the number of cameras around the field, he couldn't help but be impressed by Gami's display of strength. At least, that's who he attributed All Might's inability to chase to. If anything, he could always play off the strange occurrence himself. None of the other teachers except Nezu, who already knew, would doubt any explanation he came up with. Though he couldn't help but notice the ignored pair of handcuffs dangling from Midoriya's waist before the cameras lost him completely. Even if Midoriya hadn't known Gami was going to prevent All Might's chase, he still should have noticed the hero was partially restrained, even if he was panicked. It wouldn't have been the cleanest victory, but Aizawa figured there was still a good shot of getting at least one of the cuffs around All Might's arm. But he'd ran away with Bakugo instead, despite all his kicking and screaming. He'd never really seen Midoriya so fiercely adamant about something, much less Bakugo of all people. "What the hell did you turn into? What the fuck have you become?" Aizawa's jaw went slack as he realized it. Midoriya was trying to break Bakugo's curse now, during the exercise. But why now? Surely he knew the uphill battle he was already fighting with Bakugo as his partner against All Might. Why would he try now to break him of an influence presumed to be over a decade old? Bakugo wasn't going to listen to reason. According to Midoriya, he'd merely cling onto irrational hate until it killed him or his relationship with him. And right now, Midoriya didn't have anyone else, any human, to rely on. Wait. His eyes slowly shifted down, catching Nezu, now frowning at Midoriya's timely escape from both All Might and the cameras in his peripherals. No, it couldn't be. There was no way. Except, Nezu didn't seem to care about putting Midoriya in this uncomfortable and outright dangerous situation. Nezu had purposely gone behind everyone's backs to change Midoriya's pairing so he'd be forced to work with Bakugo, who he knew was cursed. Nezu had refused to give Midoriya a choice, a say, or even so much as a warning. His mind stretched further back. Nezu had forced Aizawa's hand, preventing him from arguing any of his latest decisions concerning Midoriya, despite being the one to have given Aizawa guardianship over him. Nezu had forced Midoriya to interact, to fight, with the hero killer, after barely surviving his night against him, who actively tried to murder him and his friends, to supposedly just appease the Hero Association. Nezu made sure to drill over and over just how helpless Midoriya and Aizawa truly were in any of the decisions he chose to make. Few things in this world made Aizawa's blood run cold anymore. Nezu was infected with Midoriya's curse just the same as Bakugo was. The hero felt his veins flash freeze over. How had he missed this? He resisted every fiber of his body calling him to panic, to ignore all the instincts he'd been taught over the course of his career and just shut down. What should he do now? What could he do? It wasn't as simple as just flashing his quirk and shutting off its effects, as he'd always done for students with rogue and uncontrollable quirks. He didn't know how to fix this. Hell, Midoriya barely knew how to fix this. Enough already! And yet, Midoriya had chosen to try anyway. I managed to get through to him, and it was a complete turnaround. It was like his hatred for me completely lifted. If Midoriya had the gall to whistle in the dark, then so could he. Aizawa turned towards Nezu, who immediately replaced any sour expression he had left on his face with that cheeky smile masking him like a fog. Is this really just about passing or failing? Aizawa asked pointlessly, throwing Nezu's words back at him. Because that's rich, coming from you. Nezu wore a convincing look of mock confusion, even raising an eyebrow to sell it. Whatever do you mean? Aizawa took a firm step forward, forcing Nezu to inch back, even just barely. I know how you feel about us, for what they did to you, but right now you're not proving yourself to be any better. For the first time since Midoriya's test exercise started, Nezu did not have an immediate comeback. In fact, no one knew how to respond to the low blow Aizawa had just given, as a pin-drop silence instead washed over the room. Students stopped whispering, now sharing glances of worry and confusion. The rest of the staff looked between themselves in shock. One of Nezu's paws unconsciously rose to touch the scar over his eye, but it stopped halfway, torn between hurt and hate. Yamada's heart wept at how everything had fallen apart. Both of them had crossed that invisible line of maturity a while ago, and Yamada himself was ashamed at how he'd allowed it to continue, especially in front of all his students. He placed a stiff hand on Aizawa's shoulder, trying to pull him back. Sho, enough, you're going too far. He didn't know what to say when his partner shrugged him off, without a second thought. No, I'm not done. Aizawa continued forward as Nezu started to step back, further isolating themselves from the rest of the staff as the students could only watch. He then shot one of his arms out to point at a monitor that was replaying the captured moments of Midoriya before he disappeared from the video feed. Look at him, Nezu. Does he remind you of anything? Nezu slowly shifted his beady eyes, giving up his act of innocence and wearing a scowl across his mouth. His eyes met that of Midoriya's, panicked yet stern, full of every wavering emotion, and yet hardened by a shell of determination. The video feed replayed how Midoriya's teeth clenched with grit, how his face scrunched in desperation, how his brows furrowed with fight, how his eyes burned with resilient dreams, how he fought against everything that tried so brutally to tear him down. Doesn't he look familiar? The scowl on Nezu's face dropped. His ears anxiously flicked down as something of recognition shone in his little black eyes. His head filled with the echoes of his own screams, his own begs for mercy, from when he was just a little helpless creature. Aizawa pressed on in speech and step. He knew it was dirty to bring up Nezu's past so openly, so pointedly, pulling it out into the spotlight where he could no longer hide from it. But Nezu had crossed that line a while ago, curse or not, and he wasn't afraid to follow him over it. Don't you look familiar? Something in Nezu's head snapped as he saw the shadowed smiles of those who laughed at his desperate cries all that time ago, and recognized one as himself. Midoriya twisted down another alley, taking every turn he could to try and throw All Might off his tail. He wasn't sure if Gami was following him, but he had more pressing matters on his mind, and he was sure the ghost would find his way back to him in time. He nearly lost his grip as Bakugo nailed him hard in the side, but he readjusted and pushed forward, gritting his teeth. "Damn it, put me down, you fucking runt!" Bakugo snapped his jaws at him, practically frothing at the mouth. "I don't want your help. I said I don't fucking—" "So you'd rather lose? What kind of hero are you?" Midoriya tried to focus on where he was running, as well as the point of separating Bakugo from the fight, among all his building anger and tears and another thankfully quickly fading headache. "You're going to let All Might, the bad guy, win because you're too pathetic to work with me?" He could feel the other pause in his arms, but he couldn't be sure. His eyes too busy darting around corners looking for All Might's waiting fist, Gami's fleeting form, another camera's watchful gaze, anything, everything else. "What the hell did you just— You'd rather let All Might destroy the city, let him kill as many innocent people as he wants? You're just going to lie down and give up?" He was shouting too at this point, forgetting his desperate maneuvers to escape detection as everything else suddenly became more overwhelming. He forgot everything important as everything else became more so. "How can you even think you'll be anything like All Might one day?" The room grew silent as Aizawa's words echoed around its empty walls. Neither staff nor student made a move or dared to utter a word, eyes locked onto the standoff. But with time, the heat that had stifled the air slowly dulled to freeze the room instead. The wrinkles in Aizawa's brow softened as the ferocity that had crushed his face and his heart gave way. Nezu had no retort, as the black beads of his eyes glimmered with something Aizawa had never seen in him before, and slowly, a haunted look washed over him, and his white fur washed out a shade paler than what could ever be possible. Aizawa swallowed his victory, as he had all his victories before it, like the burn of liquor down his throat. A slow drawl came from Nezu's mouth as his eyes glanced around, the fear in his students, the helplessness of his staff, the betrayal in Aizawa's hands, and the guilt in his eyes. "What did I—" And then to his own pause, as his brain pieced it all together. Shame replaced all his hate. "Excuse me, for a moment." No one moved, no one could, to stop their principal from quietly exiting the observation room without any more of his explanation or an apology, his tail tucked pitifully between his legs until it disappeared as the door clicked shut behind him. The sound brought Aizawa out of his head as his feet snapped forward, his heart pulling him to follow, his ears ringing in the aftermath of the disaster that he couldn't have avoided, yet was completely and utterly his fault. When someone touched his shoulder, he halted, caught between guilt and conviction. "Sho, please, just leave him alone," Yamada pleaded, his costume glasses hiding the anguish in his eyes. I think you've done enough." Everything human in Aizawa begged him to listen. "The way they all acted, it wasn't their fault. They didn't have any control over my curse warping their minds." Everything human in Aizawa begged him to listen. He gently pushed off his partner's hand, ignoring the deafening sound of heartbreak, as he was reminded of what guilt tasted like, what betrayal felt like, what secrets looked like. "I'm sorry." He was reminded why he never kept secrets from Yamada, why he never kept secrets at all. Aizawa made his choice and stepped towards the door. Nezu, he really shouldn't be alone right now. But this was not his secret to tell. "I'll explain everything later." He made a great effort not to promise anything as he chased after the principal, shutting the door behind him. Midoriya skidded to a stop in a random alley, void of any cameras he could see and any noise he could hear. He panted. He heaved, trying to catch his breath and his emotions as both threatened to consume him. His mind was scrambled, his thoughts scattered and unfocused, his head pounding in his ears. So when Bakugo managed to kick him in the back of the legs, he only had instinct to respond with, which threw him to the dirty alleyway ground. Bakugo growled at him, still with spit and bile pooled at his mouth as he quickly raised his feet to retort with his fists. "Aren't you tired?" He stopped. "Just hope for a quirk in your next life and go take a swan dive off the roof." The dam in Midoriya broke. "I'm tired. I can't do this anymore." Midoriya's knees threatened to buckle, his hands pushing at his eyes, desperately trying to keep everything in. "Damn it, aren't you tired of this?" For the first time in over a decade, Bakugo hesitated. "What? How dare a quirkless failure like you pity me?" For the first time in over a decade, Midoriya did not. "Is this the hero you wanted to grow up into? Can you still root for yourself?" His mind yanked himself back to the beginning, the very beginning. When they used to watch All Might beat up low-life villains on the television, when they used to imagine themselves in the hero's place, when they used to promise that they'd end up there together. "I can't see anything of the kid who wanted to win because it was right. All I can see is the hateful, spiteful shell of a person who took his place." Midoriya stepped forward, letting everything explode out of him. He knew he'd never really gotten to know Bakugo for who he truly was, but was it wrong for him to wish for that Bakugo again? Was it wrong to wish for fleeting memories of a 4-year-old child in hopes that they would be any different than what he was faced with now? Did he really want to be friends with Bakugo again? Was he trying to satiate some aged guilt he'd been holding on to all this time? "I managed to get through to him, and it was a complete turnaround. It was like his hatred for me completely lifted." Was he really doing this for Bakugo? Or for himself? "I'll tell you what I think, you fucking runt. I think you should learn your place." But Midoriya had given up on holding everything in a while ago, and there was no stopping his train wreck as it barreled down the track straight for them both. Bakugo stepped back, clutching at his head, his eyes screwed shut, desperately trying to keep him out or something else in. "Stop. What are you doing to me?" "You wanted to be a hero just like All Might, because he never loses." The hurricane of emotions in his head dug around for every faded memory that could be found, that could be used to justify the rage and despair that consumed him. It dug up how Bakugo wanted to be unbeatable, undefeatable, just as All Might was on the television. It dug up how Bakugo used to try to stand up to what he knew was wrong. It dug up all the other kids, the friends he used as lackeys, that had always cheered him on from the sidelines, who'd always rooted for his inevitable success. "You weren't supposed to get a quirk, and even though you did, you should know that what you have was never meant to save anyone." Would they still be rooting for him now, if they saw the person he'd managed to twist into? "Stop talking. Shut up. You were never supposed to be here." The prospect of everything irrational found its footing again. "But All Might never loses because he's fighting for something," Midoriya screamed. He could scream too. If Bakugo got to yell at him every waking moment, for every waking thing, then it was only fair. If he wanted to scream just this one time, it was only fair. He deserved to. It was his turn. It was his right. "It infects people with unnatural hate so they act irrationally, to ruin their relationship with me." Something tried to argue with him. The person yelling at him wasn't Bakugo. It had never been. Who was he? To take out a 10-year rage on the twisted amalgamation of what was unquestionably his own mistakes. He'd never asked Bakugo to hate him, like the very scum of the earth, like the low-life gunk that stained the sidewalk, but then again, neither had Bakugo. "Get out of my head! Stop fucking with me! This is all your fault, you and your fucking quirk." But the person yelling at him now wore Bakugo's face, so he yelled back, "He's fighting for all the people who can't fight for themselves." The way they all acted, it wasn't their fault. They didn't have any control over my curse warping their minds. But it was. It was Bakugo's fault, and yet it wasn't, just like how it was his own fault, and yet it wasn't. He never asked for this. Neither of them had asked for this. It had been so remarkably easy to grow up blaming himself for losing his childhood friend, and then even easier to blame him instead. It had been so much easier, but now his anger and guilt clashed like an oil spill as what had been so black and white was suddenly thrown into gray. They'd both hurt each other, and they'd both been hurt. Everyone was guilty, but by the same reason no one was, and it was that hopeless inculpability that left him so frustratingly helpless. "Let me tell you, you fill me with nothing but hate, a pathetic excuse for a human being." "Shut up! Shut up, damn it! Fucking shut up!" He wanted so badly to be angry, and there was no one left but the world. "So what the hell are you fighting for?" "I don't know!" Bakugo fell to his knees, hands clawing at his ears. His fingers buried their way into his hair like parasites, desperately tugging at his scalp, trying to get everything out. His head collapsed, bowing under the weight of everything as reason returned to his eyes. And just as suddenly, Midoriya found the leak where all his frustration had been gushing out of unceremoniously plugged, and he choked on all his own venom instead. It burned his throat. It burned his chest, a pulsating ache that refused to leave so long as the other lay pitifully curled at his feet. "I don't—" Bakugo stuttered, a hauntingly alien sound. He grit his teeth, and his muscles clenched, and it was only then that Midoriya realized how badly he was shaking and how badly he was trying to stop with no success. His eyes, even in their place in the shadows of his face, pulled tightly along his skin, taut with the tension of a stretched rubber band. "I don't know." Midoriya flinched as Bakugo hunched over further, froze under his own skin, under his own guilty hesitation. He couldn't move, at least that's what he told himself, until the earth by Bakugo's knees started to darken droplet by droplet. "Bakugo—" He reached an arm out. "What the hell did you do to me?" Bakugo howled at him, a mangled cry laced with defensive devastation, teeth bared like a wounded animal, hands curled into claws at his own sides, tearing himself to pieces as he fell apart. And yet, Midoriya watched the hate in his eyes, from a fire he'd known all his life, slowly morph into the helpless gaze of a child from his faded memories. Why am I so angry at you?" Bakugo's lip quivered, and he bowed his head once again to hide the weakness streaming down his face. "And yet, I'm being flooded with my hatred and loathing for you, none of which feels like my own." Midoriya's teeth sunk into his lip, raising a hand to cover his own mouth as it curled into a quiet sob. "I'm sorry." But he could offer nothing more than hollow condolences. "I'm so sorry." And for as hard as he fought against his own grief, for as hard as he pressed his eyes together, for as hard as his mind tried to reason that he was still in the middle of his goddamn final exam right now, he couldn't stop the tears that welled up at his eyes anyway. And when the droplets started to stain his cheekbones, he couldn't stop the feeling that he didn't deserve to feel like this in the first place. "Izuku, Midoriya turned on his heels, wiping the shame from his eyes as he was met with Gami's comforting shape, Bakugo still blankly staring at the ground. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Midoriya shook his head, swallowing the last of everything vulnerable for something more fitting. "I cannot hold All Might back any longer. I apologize." Midoriya couldn't help the sputter as the breath of a curse escaped him. "I do not know how much time we have until—" "Bakugo!" He turned to the other with a voice that betrayed all the firmness he meant to command. "I know how you're feeling right now, but—" "You don't know anything!" Bakugo snapped, any remnants of anything weak fizzling out with his intensity, but it only took a moment for him to fall back into despondency. "I don't even know." "It infects people with unnatural hate, so they act irrationally, to ruin their relationship with me." Midoriya winced, pressing his eyes tight, selfishly trying to forget how much he did know. "We can figure this out. We will figure this out." Bakugo lurched. "How can you just say that?" "Because right now, All Might is out there actively looking for us, and if you couldn't beat him on your own, then there's no way in hell I can," he admitted with a clenched fist, caught between the point of the final exam and the point of bringing Bakugo to this secluded alleyway in the first place. He looked up and met Bakugo's hard gaze, with a plea long forgotten in the depths of cobwebs of his childhood heart. "This is our chance to fix things, to fix us, because we won't stand a chance against him unless we start now." Bakugo's hard gaze lowered to his trembling hands. Everything just feels wrong. So let's make it right." Midoriya reached out, reaching for a life he'd lost, reaching for a life he hadn't realized he could ever have again, reaching for a past his heart silently begged to taste again, reaching for this one last shot at forgiveness for them both. "We don't need to fight anymore. We can do this together." Bakugo looked from Midoriya's hand up to his wide, watery eyes and slowly picked up his pieces from the dirty alley floor. He saw a promise, and he reached out for it. Aizawa picked up his pace, surprised to see just how far the principal had managed to go in the span of only a few moments. "Nezu." The other slowed, turning his head slightly over his shoulder just so one beady eye could peek. "I'm just retrieving something from my office, so if you could excuse me." We both know that's not true. Aizawa pushed, stepped forward, refused to learn his lesson. So if we could just stop and talk. What is there to talk about, Aizawa? Nezu turned around completely, and it was then that Aizawa could truly make out the haunting glaze that coated his eyes, the flat press of his ears, the shameful quiver of the corners of his mouth. And just for a moment, Aizawa didn't see the principle of UA, but instead the tragedy of humanity's scorn, standing pitifully before him as the first time they met. But Nezu did not let the pathetic look grace him for long, stepping towards Aizawa with his tail tucked between his legs and passion in his stance. You saw everything that happened in there. Whatever fire he'd scavenged up was lost. Everyone did. And like he always did, the rodent collected himself, clasping his paws together and closing his eyes, though his ears still fell with guilt. Who am I to call myself the principal of this school if I can't take care of all my students? They both knew exactly what he meant. Aizawa frowned, resisting the urge to gnaw at his lip. Even if you were... He struggled to get the word out for some unknown reason. Cursed. I shouldn't have said those things. Don't coddle me, Aizawa, Nezu snapped before growing dejected, turning his back away as his head fell. There is a truth to all the wretched things people say. You are merely an extension. Nezu, even from his place supposedly so high above human faults, rolled his eyes downcast, hiding his mistakes away in the shadows of his shame. He said nothing more. There was nothing more to say, other than the soft echoes of his oversized sneakers as he began to walk away. But Aizawa refused to learn his lesson, and too refused to walk back to the observation room. That's fair. Nezu spun back around, mouth almost agape, eyebrows fluttering in disbelief as he caught the unconcerned shrug that rolled off Aizawa's shoulders as his words stopped him in his tracks. That would be fair, Aizawa continued, stopping his steps once he was only a few feet away from the principal. Except we both know that you didn't say it. Nezu's face of shock then morphed into a scowl. Enough with the semantics. Did Todoroki say it then? Did Bakugo? Did Ida? He questioned, pushing and pushing and pushing, until he finally felt himself snap. Hell, Nezu, did Midoriya's mother say it? Are you really going to try and argue that she really meant all the things she said and did to her own son? Nezu turned away slightly, a cynical, sad look washing over him. How could we ever know for sure? How could I ever know? His paws, which he stuffed into his pockets before, came out to pathetically grab at his own fleeting morale. When I can't even tell which of my own actions seem unlike myself and which are just a fault of my own withering sanity. Aizawa's ferocity dampened, and he couldn't catch the heavy sigh that escaped him, as his heart hammered with the guilty weight of his own humanity. Do you remember how you treated Midoriya before? Nezu cocked a brow with a sneer of self-hatred. Before? What do you mean before? It wasn't like today was the first instance of my blatant disregard for his safety and well-being. Aizawa shook his head, opting to ignore the principal's dig at himself. I'm talking about the very first week of school. The first time you met Midoriya personally. Would you care for a cup of tea? You didn't hesitate to pull him from an unsafe home, to put him with Hisashi and I. Aizawa looked off to the side briefly with shame. Even when I did. And you'll be staying with Aizawa-san in the meantime. In your own, albeit unique, way. You've always made sure Midoriya has felt comfortable and safe since the beginning. If you need time to collect yourself, that is all right. You saw a piece of yourself, your former self, in Midoriya. Aizawa softened, his thoughts racing through all the things he knew for sure, and all the things he could only assume. And you wanted to protect him the same way you wished someone had for you. Nezu bit his teeth into a grimace, but Aizawa refrained from commenting, allowing him the reprieve to hide his eyes with his paws and stifle his vulnerabilities in his throat. I was smiling like them, Nezu choked out. Despite everything, I became just like them, curse or otherwise. No, you didn't. There were some comments, however, that Aizawa could not refrain from saying, because you fought them to get where you are right now. Nezu's scarred eyes seemed to twitch ever so slightly. You fought for a life they didn't think was yours. You fought for rights they didn't think you deserved. After being given every reason to hate us for what they did to you, you're here, helping the next batch of heroes learn to protect people just like you protected Midoriya, just like you'd needed back then. The slow burn that had taken its sweet time crawling up Aizawa's throat finally trickled from his lips like a volcanic eruption, an inevitable burst and subsequently labored march as the deepest pits of his rigid honesty came spilling out. "And you're going to let this be the thing that finally beats you?" Nezu looked up at him openly, a watery film coating his eyes as his beady black nose twitched against the moisture that matted his fur. And for the first time since they'd met, Nezu actually looked like the wounded animal Aizawa subconsciously retained from the memories they both tried to forget. Because while there was always truth in wretchedness, not all truth was wretched. Aizawa looked down at him pointedly, though his eyes held a vulnerability usually saved for the depths of his heart. "We promised Midoriya that we would fight this with him. But I promise you'll never have to do it alone again. And I sure as hell don't plan on losing." The hallway returned to silence as Nezu bowed his head out of sight, the shadows of his face emerging to hide the expression once again. Aizawa kept a lazy gaze over him, but he found his voice tired, the lining of his throat scorched from his own heat and the cavern of his mouth dry from his own frankness. And with the last of his persisting strength, he hung his own head as well, letting black strands of his hair fall out of place as he finally hit empty. The world stopped for a moment, making room for two more of countless men to finally reach rock bottom. "Well." And while Nezu's shoulders dropped, his head lifted one final time to reveal an albeit shaky smile painted over his mouth, fragile and disjointed, like stained glass, yet just as sincerely ornate. "I don't plan on being outdone by you, then." The world didn't have time to stop for two of the men that left rock bottom, but Aizawa Nezu stopped anyway. Aizawa huffed a chuckle through his nose, mixed with a sigh of relief as he found ease in providing his own complimentary smile. Nezu turned back around, nodding his head once again away from the observation room, further down the hall. And this time, Aizawa made no comment, or any further effort, really, in opposition as the principal continued his trek alone to wherever he decided his office would be. "I'll come back to the observation room soon," he stated with an earnestness Aizawa hadn't heard in a long time. "Just go back without me." Aizawa nodded in return, echoing the gesture with a soft hum despite Nezu needing neither. He turned around himself, stepping away from their hallway standoff, ignoring the ever-growing thoughts of what he'd need to address behind that door once he opened it back up again. That could wait. Seeing Midoriya on the cameras could wait. Hearing Yamada chew into him could wait. Because he was just one man, despite any and all heroics, and he could only hope to stand against the tide of the world one wave at a time. And Aizawa. This time, however, he rose from salty shores with another at his side. "Thank you." All Might raced through the ruined cityscape, trying to keep his breath steady under all his added weights as he ducked up and down streets looking for his students. He wasn't expecting Midoriya to swoop in and save Bakugo like he did, especially given their volatile relationship, but he really wasn't expecting Midoriya to interfere at all by the way he'd been hanging back most of the exam. But that was a pathetic excuse for what was essentially just him letting his guard down and assuming Midoriya would stay docile. At this point, he shouldn't be assuming anything with that kid. But given the fact he hadn't spotted the boy yet with all the ground he'd covered, he had to assume Midoriya was heading for the exit. After all, only one of them needed to cross it to pass, and by the way Bakugo was practically clawing his way out of Midoriya's grip the last time he saw them, he couldn't imagine they'd stick together for long. He'd find Midoriya first and stop him from ending the exam early, and once he dealt with him, he'd deal with Bakugo. That kid was so intent on fighting him, All Might was sure he'd end up fighting him all on his own. A sudden rush of hot air erupted from behind him as Bakugo launched himself from the alley that All Might had just passed. "Where the fuck are you going?" All Might spun around, already preparing himself to block an expected explosion, but his body faltered when he saw the look on Bakugo's face. Bakugo clenched his teeth in a horribly pained grimace, his face scrunched desperately to keep his welled tears locked away behind his eyes. His irises were small and watery, but steady as he let loose an explosion he knew All Might would block with ease. As All Might was forced to shield his face from the blast, Bakugo threw himself out of the line of fire, and from a place deep down inside his heart that he long thought was cold and empty, he let out a long, guttural scream. "Midoriya!" The other dashed out of the alley All Might was about to pass, sandwiching the pro-hero between them, wearing Bakugo's gauntlet on his dominant hand. Midoriya raised his arm up, aiming both the nozzle of the grenade and the flesh of his bare palm right at All Might's back. The hero tried to turn around, catching everything playing out in his peripherals. "Fire!" But he couldn't. There was no time. Midoriya pulled the pin at the same time he released all the DT welled up at his fingertips. The resulting incineration was terrifying. A blinding light infected the entire street, completely engulfing All Might in all its glory. The pavement rippled from the shock wave, sending strips of broken asphalt flying amongst hurricane winds. The buildings around them rattled, as windows shattered instantly, pipes bursted, and concrete support pillars snapped like toothpicks, all while Midoriya was thrown in the opposite direction, away from the sudden heat that threatened to scorch his hair. He heard something in his shoulder snap like a rubber band, but he could barely give it a second thought as his ears filled with the telltale sounds of Bakugo's escape plan, watching the other blast his way over him and towards the exit gate. "Let's go!" Midoriya didn't hesitate to follow him. Gami, who had been hiding inside one of the adjacent buildings to avoid being blinded by the burst of light, quickly emerged to catch up to his successor. However, his face immediately scrunched into a frown as his eyes swept over the boy. "You're favoring your left arm." "I underestimated the recoil." Midoriya was indeed favoring his left arm, his blast coming out uneven as he desperately tried to compromise keeping pace with Bakugo and mitigating the sharp pain shooting up his nerves. "I think I dislocated my shoulder." Gami's eyes trailed up to the joint, hissing when he saw the way the arm almost seemed to hang lifelessly at Midoriya's side, being whipped around by the continual blasts he was using to propel himself. "Stop, you're making it worse. Let me fix it." Midoriya grimaced, trying to keep his mind off the feeling. "I can't," he panted, but his explosion started to dwindle regardless. Bakugo heard Midoriya start to slow down behind him, and surprisingly, he heard something in his heart tell him to slow down too. Even more surprisingly, he listened. Midoriya was able to properly catch up to Bakugo as he opted to run alongside him, the two side by side as they raced past all the buildings, All Might decimated with his shockwave from the start of the exam. Bakugo looked at him oddly, his eyes fixating on the disgusting way Midoriya's shoulder bombed out of place against his skin. "It's fine." It was really only a half-lie, since Midoriya had stopped registering the pain a short while ago. His eyes refocused ahead of him, then promptly lit up. "Oh my god! We're almost there! It's right there!" And sure enough, as Bakugo looked forward, the sight of the distant but enlarging escape gate was there to greet him. Midoriya glanced behind his back warily, the smoke from his massive explosive combination finally starting to clear. "I don't see All Might chasing after us." Both of them knew that wasn't a good thing. Bakugo grit his teeth, adjusting his gauntlet's position on his wrist. "If he catches up to us, I'll give him another good whack. You better keep fucking running." Midoriya scrunched his eyebrows in confusion. "But you'd be faster. I'm the one slowing you down." All Might's sudden appearance in the space between them prevented him from finishing. Bakugo snapped his arm up reflexively, aiming his right hand at All Might's head without even a second thought. But before he could reach out to pull the pin on his grenade, All Might wrapped a hand around the gauntlet and squeezed it until it shattered into indistinguishable pieces. Bakugo and Midoriya could only stare in shock as they watched it crumble, ears haunted by the sound of All Might's laughter. All Might's fist then found its way to Bakugo's spine, sending him clattering to the ground with a sharp whack. But Bakugo's resulting scream was snuffed out as the hero's foot promptly pressed him into the dirt, pinning both his arms under his chest awkwardly. Gami tried to pull his successor away. "Damn it! Izuku, run! Fucking run!" But in a bout of horrified adrenaline, Midoriya did not, raising both his arms and cupping his hands as decay screamed for freedom from his veins. It had just reached his fingertips when All Might snatched both his wrists up in one massive clutch, hoisting him off the ground like a prized hunt. His decay barreled forth regardless, but instead erupted crooked and weak, lacking much of its original force. However, All Might did not expect it to continue at all and flinched instinctively away in surprise. The pressure on Bakugo's back from All Might's foot lifted ever so slightly, but it was enough for the boy to stealthily slip one arm to freedom. All the while, Midoriya processed nothing, his misaligned shoulder pulling tightly against his skin, his eyes clenched shut as a pain he'd nearly forgotten found its way back to him. "I'll admit," All Might sneered down at them, a gesture so unusual it made both students' skin crawl. "I wasn't expecting you two to be able to work together long enough to pull that diversion off back there." Midoriya squirmed desperately, his mind racing practically everywhere else, in Shigaraki's grasp at the USJ, and Stain's gaze at Hosu, but every tremor in his body abruptly stopped as his dislocated shoulder shifted further out of place. He was forced back to the present as a debilitating burn coiled its way to his brain. All he could do was sink his teeth into his lips to hold back the scream that threatened to escape. "But this—" All Might did not notice the blood that leaked from Midoriya's lips and dripped from his chin. "Is the end of the line." A few drops landed on the dirt, just a few inches away from Bakugo's transfixed eyes. Bakugo's free arm trembled as all his nerves in his body hardened like cement, his fingers curling like claws. Gami just managed to duck underground as a bright explosion lit up at All Might's feet. The hero looked down instinctively, immediately wincing as his eyes were assaulted by a burning glare. He couldn't stop the reflexes in his body from moving to shield his vision, and his grip on Midoriya easily gave out, allowing the boy to tumble to the ground. Gami returned to the brightness of the real world just enough to grip his successor's injured arm, fighting as his body slowly started to fade into wispiness. I apologize in advance. Gami pushed hard, and this time Midoriya couldn't hold back the wounded cry as his mentor crudely snapped his arm back into place. Midoriya pushed himself to his feet, pushing himself to keep trudging towards the exit gate when he felt a hand grip his good arm. Bakugo readied himself into a throwing stance, one that reminded Midoriya of the quirk apprehension test at the beginning of the year. I'm going to fling you to the gate. Midoriya balked. What? Well, what about you? It doesn't matter. We're not going to win like this, he bit back, nervously checking behind his back towards the fading smoke. Only one of us needs to get through that gate, so do it. An alien feeling engulfed Midoriya, one that begged him to do anything else. Go! But there was no time. Midoriya felt the back of his already destroyed costume burn up as Bakugo's flames singed through the fabric and into his skin, a heat that not even the rush of the wind around him could quell. Just like all the other burn scars on his body, it burned like hell, seeping deep into his nerves. But unlike all those other burn scars, it hurt him in a way he'd never felt before, past his nerves and deep into his heart. He forced his eyes open, past the pain, past the wind, past another sudden headache, past everything in the way, as he soared right towards the exit gate. His eyes locked onto the open doors, locked onto everything they'd worked for, and reached out for a new beginning to a decade-long end. My, how naive, heroes. Midoriya couldn't even get his curse out, spit, bile, and blood erupting from his lips instead, as All Might suddenly jumped from behind Bakugo and dove from the sky right into him, driving him into the ground where dirt then filled his mouth after. He struggled to find the energy to pick himself back up as All Might laughed overtop him. He was just so fucking tired. He'd tried so hard. His body ached, his heart ached, and the cool earth beneath him called him to give in and give up. All Might would understand. Aizawa would understand. Bakugo would understand. It was just a stupid test after all. It's not like any of it was real. He could feel Gami tugging desperately at him to get up, but he just couldn't find the strength. Go, Midoriya! You'd rather lose? You'd rather lose? You of all people! The strength found him. Midoriya's heart jump-started in his chest with a metallic rattle. He didn't bother looking back to see Bakugo's expression or to check if All Might would chase after him, or just in general hesitance. Echoes of words were ringing about in his ears, along with the hum of his shoddy eardrums, and though he could barely hear, he could listen, to the heat at his back, and the heat in his heart as he scrambled to his feet, and did the one thing he'd always been good at, running. Gami pulled his successor out of the way as Bakugo engulfed All Might in an explosion of a size he hadn't seen since the finale of the sports festival. But that was all he could do, as the blinding light forced the ghost back to the safety of darkness underground. Go! Bakugo roared, a desperate, aching roar from behind, laced with blood and sweat and tears Midoriya found all too familiar. Quick! Run! Midoriya continued to race forward as another deafening explosion whipped from behind him, currents of heat and smoke threading through his hair. Sweat dripped down his face as his skin glistened like a wood finish, his teeth heaved like an aged warship, groaning like worn metal, barely keeping all his pained whines locked up. His eyes strained in his skull, and yet they remained steadily focused on the ever-closer exit gate. He was so close. They were so fucking close. He could hear Bakugo tailing close behind, warding off All Might with another risky, full-power explosion. Midoriya pushed his body to use his own blast again. Despite creaky protests from his weak shoulder, the gap between him and Bakugo was growing ever so slightly. His stamina was draining ever so quickly. He was going to cross through first, and All Might wouldn't let him. He couldn't bind the hero in his peripherals, but All Might wouldn't ignore him. All Might would not let him finish the exam, for the both of them. All Might would not let him cross, but that was okay. Tears welled at his eyes, accepting that he would personally never cross that finish line. A present for the boy who wants to run. All Might would target him down and pummel him into the earth until he could run no more. But paradise be damned if Midoriya wasn't going to fight like hell, like a feral wild animal, until he went down kicking and screaming, and until Bakugo crossed the finish line for them both. We don't need to fight anymore. We can do this together. And for their decade-long fight, Midoriya could accept this as its end. Move! There was time, but he did not. Midoriya stumbled as a hard shove collided with his bruised back, forcing him a few steps forward, as All Might's fist came crashing down on something else. But the touch was not as cold as he expected, and All Might's hands did not collide with earth alone. Midoriya glanced back, and his eyes met the scene of Bakugo's head wrapped in one of All Might's hands, held against an earthy crater made by its own impact. All Might spoke, likely some cryptic words of wisdom as a final homage to Bakugo's efforts, but all Midoriya could hear was Bakugo's final whispery homage to him. "Quick, go, you fucking nerd." And Bakugo fell for the last time. Time slowed to a standstill, his ears filled with the haunted song of All Might's dramatic laughter, his doe eyes naive and horrified, unable to tear away from Bakugo's still body. The gate was right there, right behind him, just one last stride away. "We can figure this out. We will figure this out." He could still clear the gate. All Might was still distracted, smiling with Bakugo's head practically crushed in his hands. "We can't just leave him." Only one of them needed to cross in order to pass. He could still do it, even all by himself, even without Bakugo. "And if you couldn't beat him on your own, then there's no way in hell I can." Bakugo had taken the finishing blow for him, had told him to run, and had left himself behind in his place. Why am I so angry at you?" He had been leaving Bakugo behind his whole life, refusing to look back at anything he could possibly regret, and now, staring back at full attention, he faced the guilty consequences of his actions, both past and present, both at his own hands, and entirely out of his reach. "We don't need to fight anymore. We can do this together." He could not continue running forward, running away, for a single second more. All Might saw Midoriya move out of the corner of his eye, swiveling his head to catch the boy before he could cross the finish line. "I won't let you get away, young Midoriya." He was not prepared to find the boy rushing at him instead. Midoriya launched himself unabashedly at the #1 hero, cutting through the short distance between them with a double blast, ignoring the wince that traveled straight to his brain from the ache in his shoulder. He watched All Might stiffen, preparing for impact, and all of a sudden a rogue thought decided on a new course of action instead. He dove between All Might's legs in a crude slide, scraping his exposed skin against all the stirred-up rubble lying around them, and as he did, he called his scythe to its home in his hands, clutching the handle close to his chest as both he and it passed through. Still, to use a scythe is the most effective with the intent to cut flesh. The tip of the blade ran along the backs of All Might's calves, slicing through the skin and just deep enough to cleave through his muscle. The hero cried out in shock and collapsed to his knees as his legs gave out on him. Midoriya whisked away his blade before his eyes could land upon the blood that stained it, using his now free hands to rebound himself off of the broken asphalt kicked up by Bakugo's impact with the earth. He picked up Bakugo's cold, unconscious body in a scramble, hoisting the other as best he could under his arm, before forcing his legs into a scurry like a sewer rat. "This is our chance to fix things, to fix us." The space behind his eyes throbbed, his vision beginning to fade in and out. He couldn't focus on the world around him, only the dull pounding at the back of his skull that was slowly starting to become more bothersome. Midoriya didn't understand. He'd barely gotten hurt. He'd pushed through worse injuries in the past few months alone. Hell, right now, it hurt to even think that far back. Everything just feels wrong." He could hear movement behind him. The gate was right in front of him. He couldn't lose now. He couldn't let All Might get up and simply catch them, not after all they'd done, not after they'd managed to put aside a decade-long hatred, not after Bakugo had saved him from his own intended sacrifice, not after Midoriya had spilt the blood of the #1 hero in return. So let's make it right. They were almost there now. Things go back to how they were after they crossed through that gate. Bakugo had worked with him now, after being given practically no other option, and likely in a state of light delirium after breaking such an aged curse. But what about later? What if things just fell back to the past, fell back to the memories that they had for their relationship because they knew nothing else? And arguably worse, what if Bakugo chose to never speak to him again, with the suspicion that Midoriya had caused him to lose all semblance of control over his own life? Was it wrong to want to try and salvage something of their faded childhood with his old friend? Did he even want to? Or was his guilty set of morals simply guiding him through what needed to be done? Had he done any of this truly for Bakugo, or was it merely to finally gain some peace of mind at night? "So what the hell are you fighting for?" Midoriya pushed his burning legs forward, pushing the last bit of strength out that he had left. The gate was still closed, but he had no time to stop and open it, much less the presence of mind to reach out one of his hands to decay it. He just held Bakugo closer to himself, praying his hands wouldn't lose their grip, and faced his good shoulder towards the gate, preparing to smash this one to pieces, too, if that's what it took. We don't need to fight anymore. We can do this together. His ankle nearly gave out on the next step. Come on. His vision swirled from his own sockets like a merry-go-round. Come on. His ears finally filled with enough ringing that he couldn't hear anything else if he tried. Come on. He threw himself at the closed exit gate. Come on. The gate opened just before Midoriya made contact, and something soft and secure caught them both before they could hit the ground. Midoriya's teeth bit into a relieved smile. Thank you. He then sank into the cold embrace that pulled him to the ground, shutting his eyes tightly, trying to keep it all in. A congratulatory buzzer went off, accompanied by the sounds of generic crowd cheering. Midoriya's last heartstring snapped, and he cried from his place inside Gami's arms. Thank you very much, Recovery Girl. Midoriya wheezed out from his awkward place atop one of the cots in the nurse's makeshift workplace. He laid precariously on his stomach as Recovery Girl checked his spine one more time, then readjusting the ice pack on his head. Of course, dearie. She gently kissed the top of his forehead, and almost instantly Midoriya felt his already waning strength disappear in exchange for the disappearance of his aches and pains. The swirling of his eyes and the ringing of his ears ceased, and his back no longer felt like it would snap in two. And finally, Midoriya allowed himself to relax into the softness of the sheets underneath him, sinking into cushions like quicksand. Your injuries are fairly minor this time. Thank you for that. Midoriya smiled, bleary-eyed and drunk, as Gami threaded his bony fingers through his hair. But you! She suddenly swiveled around, waving her cane threateningly at All Might, who was in the room nervously checking on Bakugo's unconscious form. You really don't know the meaning of restraint, do you? If you'd hit them just a little harder, then this could have become something I can't bring back. All Might sheepishly looked down in the small woman's rage, scratching anxiously at the skin under his costume. Recovery Girl took a deep breath, calming herself and her instincts down. Bakugo won't come to for a while, especially after my healing. You did a number on that boy. She shook her head disapprovingly. So now it's your responsibility to bring him to the secondary rooms for him to rest. I'm having Ashido and Kaminari rest there as well. The number one hero nodded vigorously before gently lifting Bakugo out of the cot and into his arms. Midoriya watched transfixed as All Might carried the other out of the infirmary, his eyes locked on Bakugo's lifeless sleep. He wanted to call out, to reach out, if only to prevent them from drifting apart once again. But instead, Midoriya turned his head away, ignoring the aching in his chest he then blamed on his injuries. He closed his eyes to press the budding tears away, and didn't open them until he was sure both had left. Midoriya fidgeted awkwardly, uncomfortable in his sudden vulnerability. Recovery Girl, is it... He cleared his throat. Is it all right if I go back to the rest of my class to watch the other exams? The nurse's attentive gaze shifted away, looking anywhere but his eyes. I'm not sure if that's a good idea right now, dearie. Last I heard, things got a little heated up there. Midoriya tried to find her stare again, his eyes woozy and confused. Heated? He repeated with a bit of a slur. I saw when Nezu got into it, she sighed, looking downcast with disapproval. I'd imagine everything is a bit tense up there, unfortunately. Things don't always go according to plan, now do they? Oh, he replied. She then turned back to Midoriya, glancing at his head with a bit of a worried stare. To be honest, I'm more worried about the concussion Bakugo gave you. If anything, I'd like to keep you here just to keep an eye on that. Her voice didn't sound any more forced than before. Hopefully it isn't the case, but if you do end up showing symptoms of a traumatic brain injury, I'd like to catch it at the start. Gami grumbled with an air of hostility, but Midoriya weakly waved him off, which was more than enough to stop him. Midoriya nodded as best he could, in his rather limp position against the cot, disappointed but understanding. Still, Recovery Girl softened. If you'd like, you can join me in my personal observation room. She gestured to the curtain behind her, blocking off another portion of the makeshift infirmary. I've access to all the same cameras and footage. It helps me get prepared beforehand for the injuries from each individual exam. She then whispered under her breath, I should really make you stay here and rest, especially since I've been so adamant about keeping extra attention on your unique health situation, but just because it's you, I'll allow it this once. Midoriya's heart thawed, and he gave back a genuine smile. That would be nice. Thank you. Midoriya moved to push himself up from his lazing position, finding his arms much shakier than he expected. In return, Gami slid his own arm underneath him, pulling him up and into his embrace. Watch his back, Recovery Girl chimed. It'll probably be a bit sore for a while. Gami moved his other hand to gently cradle the small of Midoriya's back, and the teen relaxed into the coolness of the touch. Midoriya, confident within the space of his mentor's arms, dropped from the side of the cot and onto his feet. His legs shook a little, feeling the strain deep in his nerves, but he felt no pain. Still, his fatigue left his steps slow and muddy, and Recovery Girl left him to walk on his own as she disappeared behind the curtain. It was in that relative privacy that Midoriya turned his head up to Gami. "Hey, are you all right? You've been kind of quiet." Gami looked at him for a moment too long, and then looked away. "I just do not like seeing you hurt." A chuckle blew out of Midoriya's nose. "Well, it doesn't really get better than this, but I appreciate—" "I don't like it." The sternness in Gami's voice made him pause. It lacked the hot anger he had gotten accustomed to hearing from the ghost's growing emotions, and instead, it was coated in a chill that shook Midoriya to his core. Gifted with thought, he abuses it. This world is crowded, a waste of space even as dust. He could feel something like fear forcefully push itself through his veins, and just the thought of its presence settled something uncomfortable in his gut. "I hate seeing you like this. It hurts so much. I couldn't keep you safe. I need to keep you safe." "Gami, nothing I ever do is going to be safe," Midoriya interrupted sternly. "Hell, I'll probably always be the safest hero on the field, considering I can't exactly die." I know, I just... You know I'm not going to stop, right?" He looked through him with a seriousness that came from both a softness of vulnerability and a hardness of purpose. "You know how important this is to me, right?" Gami looked downcast, and the familiar, at least what Midoriya now considered, warmth of emotion dampened his voice. "I'm sorry. I know. I am just feeling protective." The teen frowned at him softly. "I'm starting to get a little worried about you, Gami. I feel like things are starting to escalate. I mean, you shattered streetlights again. That wasn't happening before." The ghost turned away with shame. He swallowed thickly. "I'm just worried that your attachment to me is going to affect our relationship. I feel like it kind of already has." "It won't. It hasn't," Gami quickly interjected. "I promise." "You can't just promise things like that," Midoriya steamed. "You don't know. I don't know. We don't know anything." He rubbed hastily at his eyes, pressing his palms into their crevices to make sure he left nothing behind. "I know you just want me to be safe, and I'm really trying to." Midoriya's voice rang loud and clear until it dropped down to a whisper. "But I'm going to get hurt. Worse than this. Probably worse than most heroes ever will." He paused again, closing his eyes to try and compose his thoughts, wrangling with his feelings like cattle, trying to corral them into something coherent. "You're my best friend. You mean so much more to me than anything ever will, and I am never going to fault you for feeling the way that you do." Then he opened them. "But I want to help people, and that means I can't really choose the safe option. I'm going to have to take risks. Things are going to go wrong and I'll get hurt. I can't change that, and I can't change the way you feel about it either." His eyes found their place, piercing through the darkness inside Gami's hood. "So, my safest option is really just to do it all with you." Midoriya grabbed Gami's arm, feeling the thick fog of the fabric covering it cloud around his hand. He knew how selfish it sounded, how selfish it was, but he couldn't bring himself to care, pleading with his mentor to accept it regardless. "We're not always going to be perfect, but I'm always going to be with you every single step of the way." Gami knew what Midoriya wanted to hear, but he was already going to say it regardless. "I'm with you too, and nothing will change that." He put a cold hand atop Midoriya's warm one. "I will always support you in anything and everything that you do, no matter what. That I promise." The ghost shrunk back a little, pulling away to keep his hands close to his chest. "I am sorry for how I was before." Gami spoke in a small, helpless voice unbefitting for someone like him. "But I am worried that there may not be much I can do to halt what is happening to me." "I don't think most poltergeists and their attachments have the kind of relationship we do." Midoriya smiled at him with shiny eyes. "So we'll figure it out. We always do." It wasn't a solution, but right now, it was enough. They finished their short stroll to the partition separating the makeshift infirmary from where Recovery Girl supposedly had all these monitors set up, and with Gami right behind him, Midoriya pulled open the break in the curtain. There was a small yet intricate display of monitors mounted to the wall, catching nearly every angle of what Midoriya recognized as his battlefield. A table full of buttons rested at the front, and he easily picked out a set that was individually labeled, probably to switch between exam settings. Recovery Girl sat composed in one oversized office chair, spinning around slowly upon his entrance. "I was starting to worry you two got lost," she chuckled at the thought, as if the curtain was any thicker than his mangled costume. But she didn't say any more than that, so neither did he, watching carefully as she patted the second office chair next to her. "Now come." Midoriya sat himself down, careful not to jostle the aches and pains hiding in his nerves, despite the fact he knew they had been practically healed away. And once he got himself comfortable, he could feel the slither of Gami's chill embrace him from all around, and like an old blanket, he leaned back into it. "If I may," Recovery Girl turned to him, her voice softening like one wrong octave would shatter him completely. "Though I'm not exactly sure what happened, I can tell something changed between you and Bakugo today. Something for the better." She dropped the tension in her shoulders, sinking into a light smile. "I'm glad." The words came out before he could even think about them. "Me too." They both turned back to the monitors, and Recovery Girl switched the footage from his decimated cityscape to a quaint and peaceful suburban setting. Midoriya smiled, albeit a bit somberly. It reminded him a little of his old neighborhood. Quiet, unassuming, and just a bit lonely. If his memory served him right, even after his concussion, it should be Todoroki and Yaoyorozu up next against Aizawa. He had full confidence in them. They were two of his most skilled classmates, absolute powerhouses with smarts to match, but even still, he couldn't help but worry about them anyway. He hoped that whatever Recovery Girl had said happened during his match wouldn't throw them off their game. He wasn't sure what he would do if someone didn't pass their final exam because of all his mess. There was a knock at the door, on the other side of the curtain. "Come in," the nurse sang. "We're back here." The door opened with a click, and the faint taps of footsteps grew closer and louder to the curtain, keeping them from view. The person who entered hadn't spoken a word, and Midoriya felt his heart quicken in response, but Recovery Girl didn't seem uneasy in the slightest. So Midoriya swallowed his nerves, watching precariously as a hand thread through the cotton curtain fibers to slowly pull them open. Midoriya stood up instinctively, all of his overwhelming weakness suddenly gone, as he met Aizawa's quiet stare from the semblance of a doorway. Although his face remained still, there was something of a different weakness glistening in Aizawa's eyes, so much that Midoriya found himself naturally walking towards him, if only to offer an instinctual level of sympathy. Aizawa met him halfway, and they stood there in a moment, a silence, as if they'd forgotten how to speak entirely. And then he threaded his fingers carefully atop his sylvan hair, squeezing the fluffy ends in his fingertips almost to confirm to his eyes that Midoriya was really there. Aizawa let his eyes close, pulling his mouth into a taut line, breathing in sharply, anything to keep him from collapsing in on himself. "I'm so proud of you." And Midoriya collapsed into a sob, face wrinkled under the weight of everything he'd been carrying. His hands bunched at his eyes, to try and keep the waterworks in, but the familiar pressure had just made his body cry harder. His shoulders shook like an earthquake, and his lungs rattled and wheezed like a broken toy. His face flushed, and his mouth curled into a grimace as he tried and failed to stuff everything back down into the pits of his heart. Aizawa pulled him closer into a gentle hug, letting his arms find their place against the other as Midoriya dug his fingers into Aizawa's costume and hid his weakness from the world. The hero felt his own brows furrow together as he desperately fought against something alienly similar brewing in his stomach. He sucked in a breath, forcing his lungs to push the rise back down. It had always been just him and Yamada, just the two of them, and that's what Aizawa had been happy with for a while, because that was what was safe, that was what he could protect. And then Midoriya had come in and thrown everything off, and suddenly Aizawa had felt so out of place and unsure. But despite that, Midoriya had wormed his way into his heart, even without intention, and had become the missing piece that they needed all along to link everything together. And now it was too late to change that, and that was okay. They would remain two no longer, and that was okay. Aizawa wondered what his old friend would say if he could see him now, and he had to bite back a wet, bittersweet laugh. "You did great." All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 47 of Deku and Death. Chapter 48 will be up next. This fic is so incredible. I will say that out of the entirety of the fic, while there are a lot of really standout chapters, this is one that really sticks out to me the most. I think it has an incredible fight between Bakugo and Izuku and All Might showing that final exam. But in addition to that, the fact that the author managed to pull the twist in there with Nezu being infected by Midoriya's curse as well it really was incredibly done in my mind. I really like this chapter a lot. So I'm really eager to hear your thoughts and reactions to everything so far in this fic. And as always, thank you so much for listening.